ReleaseWire helps businesses connect with interested journalists and bloggers. Check out the link in the description to save 25% on your first press release.
Admiral, radar shows that we have liberals approaching at 3 o'clock, and libertarians at 9 o'clock, and conservatives at 6 o'clock. They're coming from every angle, every viewpoint. Oh, it's Political Radar with your hosts Rhonda and Elliot.
Hey, all you political junkies. Welcome to Political Radar, the best 30 minutes of unscripted and uncensored political talk you will hear all day. Episode 45, and we have State Assembly hopeful for the 80th District, Noah Reif.
Yes.
Welcome, Noah.
Well, thank you for having me, guys. You've gotten a bigger set since the last time I was here, so
yeah, things are
a little more
changed a
intimidating
little bit
this time.
So you are how many days out from the election?
19 days out, which is, I thought it was 20, but then Adam corrected me because I hadn't changed over my calendar this morning, so 19 days out.
And Adam Funk is here. He's our co-host because Elliot is on holiday. Thanks for being
I'm playing Elliot on radio today.
Thanks for being on and helping us out.
Yeah.
So this is something I would imagine, you know, at this point of your campaign, things have changed. What's going on? Like, what are you focusing on? Are you sleeping at all?
Having Donald Trump dreams.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, no, I shouldn't have said that before, but it's given me a lot of respect for what people who are involved in government, whether that be people who are staffing, people who are running these campaigns, the politicians themselves. Like, you need a certain level of moxie and a certain level of almost, I would call it, dog-headedness just to keep plowing forward. And I very much, I respect people who do this. And
now you'll have to forgive me because I don't know as much about your background, but is this your first campaign?
This is my first campaign as a candidate. I worked for the Sanders campaign. I volunteered for them from, I want to say, August of probably 2015 through the primaries, a little bit after. And that was the platform in which I was asked to run because I had people in the Brown County Democrats, and they put my name up, and I was asked if I'd be interested in running, and that is kind of how this all started. So every time I see the two people, I'm like, this is all your fault. You're the ones who got me into this. But it kind of went that way. I worked a little bit on the recall election for Governor Walker in 2012. So, but nothing to this level of, campaign planning, being the candidate, being the face. So it's a new experience for me.
And for full transparency, Noah was on our podcast prior to us having video.
Yes.
And thought it would be nice to come on and actually get a full visual of who you are and what you have to say. And so I think it's great that you're doing this again. So thank you.
Well, I'm very glad. I like to, full disclosure, like I asked, like, hey, I just emailed her, Facebooked Rhonda. I'm like, oh, would you be interested in having me back on at some point? She's like, yeah, can you do tomorrow? And I'm like, well, I can move some stuff around, but I'd be happy to be back.
No,
so
we welcome everyone back with open arms if they're willing to come on. So let's get right to some issues that you're running against John Mocco.
Correct.
And he has served for how long in the state assembly?
This will be, he just served his first term, so he's up for a first-time incumbent right now.
Okay. So how do you think he's done being there? Because Wisconsin really isn't, we're not doing that all that great economically. And
well,
there's a lot happening in education. So, yeah.
I think rather than try and say how I think Wisconsin is doing, I'm going to unpack the issues that I think are important. And hopefully in that we can kind of get through what I think is going on in Wisconsin and what we can improve on, what's working well. And I think for me, the one, especially being a young candidate, I'm a recent graduate.
How old are you?
23.
Okay.
A recent graduate of St. Norbert College, a post-grad student at the University of Green Bay right now. And for me, college affordability is certainly a big issue. It was an issue that drove me more towards a progressive slant when I was volunteering for Sanders, and it's something that we're seeing happening, issues in our own state and across the nation, and that's an issue we're working on addressing. I can come back with policies later, but I kind of want to just go through the issues I see. Another one is workers' rights. We've seen in our state, I believe that's been something that's kind of been, I'll use the word attacked over the last 6-7 years and even farther back. And we're working to ensure that working class families have the ability to live their lives in dignity and comfort. That's a big issue for us. And then finally, we're focused on our natural resources and water quality. If you look at what's happening in Kewaunee County right now, it's unacceptable. I don't know what else to say about that. And then if you look at what happened in Flint with water quality issues there, and people are like, well, it's an isolated incident, but we're all kind of in that same boat when it comes to aging infrastructure, especially with our piping, and there are issues that could potentially pop up here, and we want to make sure we address them, as well as cleaning up the Fox River and making sure that Green Bay is a habitable place, good for recreation and good for local businesses.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because I watched your opponent, John Mako's commercial. He's got a 15-second commercial out there. Mm-hmm. And he talks about, opens up that Wisconsin is a beautiful place to live. He might be biased is what he says, but it's a beautiful place to live. Well, we don't have a beautiful place to live if we don't take care of our water. Correct?
Well, yeah, I would agree with that. And
but he doesn't actually lay out, how he's going to do that in that commercial. It's like, it's a beautiful visual, but how can you keep that beautiful?
Yeah.
And what is the plan to do that?
And I'll be honest, like in his defense, a 15-second time is hard to explain anything. But I'll try and give you what I believe we can start doing to kind of address, let's just focus right now on the issues that are going on in Kewaunee County, the issues with runoff specifically. In the Brown County area and now the greater Green Bay area, we have, there are demonstration farms, COFAs, that are attempting to utilize new technologies, initiatives that are put out by municipalities, by state governments, and they're kind of the test farms, and we're trying to push those forward and showing that it's accessible to farmers, especially these COFAs, and showing if two of them can do it, and it's actually beneficial for the farmer, beneficial for their business, and beneficial for the people of Greater Green Bay, it can be applied elsewhere. And that's one practical way of doing that. I was actually at a Bringing Back the Bay tour, I believe last Friday, and this is their third annual, and they have these two demonstration farms that are doing very well, and they're utilizing these tech, and it's about making sure that it's available to other farms and showing that it works and it's beneficial, and pushing that as we go forward, and also making sure that another issue in Kewaunee County has been with high capacity wells. My opponent has voted to remove certain regulations from that, and it has been determined by conservation groups that has a detrimental impact on the water table. And it's, I believe right now, somewhere between 30 and 40% of wells in Kewaunee County are contaminated by some form of either a bacteria or a contaminant.
And nobody wants to live in an area where they can't have clean water. And
I think that's one thing when we talk about this. This is a very human-focused issue. I'm not looking at this from the side of a Democrat or a Republican. You want to ensure that your citizens, the people who are paying your taxes, and your neighbors, your friends, your family, all have access to clean water. It's something we've taken for granted for quite some time. And we don't really think how fragile it is. Like, our ecosystem is very fragile. And if you might, it just all of a sudden they're like, well, how did this start happening? I'm like, well, this doesn't happen in a vacuum.
So what would you do differently if you're sitting and?
Mm-hmm, yes, I would certainly I would push the COFA initiatives that farms like Brickstead Dairy are doing. Bringing Back the Bay Tour is doing.
What are those initiatives for people that don't know?
The initiatives focus on incorporating technology, different agricultural practices into making sure the farming is more sustainable and also doesn't create as much runoff. That's some of the initiatives, and kind of what they've been working very closely with environmental groups. So they're conservationists and agriculture coming together to make sure that our water quality, the water quality issues are addressed, and that we continue having a sustainable environment to live in. And
what about funding the initiatives?
Funding the initiatives, I would be in support of that.
How would you? Because I'm assuming if you put something out there for legislation,
of
you
course.
have to have funding for it as well.
I think a good way of doing that, there's in my opinion, a couple different ways. You can go through municipalities and state government pushing for federal funding on these issues. That's how they're looking at addressing it right now with in Brown County, because it's an issue of national concern, and federal government could be one to certainly support these initiatives and get funding through that.
And it's in our best interest right now that we actually look at these quality of life issues in Wisconsin because according to a full, I'm trying to remember, I read this literally in the last 6 months, more people are moving out of Wisconsin now more than ever. And why is that happening? And how do we keep them here? How do we retain them? How do we draw people and how do we retain them? And this is something that I think if you can't utilize your water system, you're not going to want to stay living there.
Right.
And if you don't have people living there, you don't have businesses that want to come in and do business because no one's going to be there to facilitate that. So this is not necessarily, as you say, a Republican Democrat issue. This is something that is a quality of life issue that we all want. We all want clean water. Mm-hmm. We all want to go to a lake and utilize that.
Yeah.
So it's really not a party line thing at all.
And I look at what's happening in our state and all of these. Society's a big jigsaw puzzle. And you have to see all the moving pieces, how everything's working, how it all fits together. And I think water quality is certainly a big issue, certainly when it comes to quality of life, because water is necessary for human life.
And you think this has been ignored generally?
I think it's been ignored. And I think you can see that, again, this kind of contamination doesn't happen just overnight.
Well, your opponent is removing regulations. I mean, that's the fact. That's not an opinion. So why would you do that?
I won't speak to his motivations, but I will speak to what I would do differently, and that's making sure that those regulations go back in place, and also working towards ensuring that agricultural and dairy farming is, that they're getting the attention they deserve, and that we aren't just putting we're not just putting the regulations and leaving these COFAs and these other agricultural operations just alone. We want to make sure that they understand we have their back, and as a state, as a legislature, and we want to make sure that we work together to make a Wisconsin that is, has these water quality issues are no longer popping up. So,
how do you feel about the issue of local control being taken away from, at the state level? I know that in the city of Green Bay, there's been a few issues, sex offender ordinances, cell tower placement. These are things that have happened on the local level that are being, the direction's coming from the state level. They're actually taking that. The state has taken the local control away. Would you be for that? Do you feel like that's something that, is important to keep the local municipality, be able to have them, negotiate their own terms on those issues and other issues as well?
Certainly. And I must admit, I don't know every local ordinance that's been taken away. I believe there's over 100 that have been.
There's a lot of them.
There's a lot, but I'm going to focus. I think there is some where the state has to have a certain standard that is set and that has to be met. But I think when it comes to dictating terms within municipalities that aren't necessarily in the best interest of the community, it's up to the community to come together and stand up for that. And I think I know this is a little off from where you started, but we talk about minimum wage increases for various communities. You talk about when it comes to transportation funding potentially. These are issues that are best served by the municipalities who live there, who understand what's happening in their community.
So you'd be more comfortable with a minimum wage done by municipality versus done by statewide?
I think I believe a state, there's a level that you have to ensure. So for now, let's say, right now the minimum wage in our state is $7.25 an hour. Let's say a municipality, let's say Appleton, let's say Green Bay, let's say, whatever community in our state you want to utilize as for this example, is say they believe that it would be better serve their citizens, their community, if they raise the minimum wage to $10 gradually. They should be able to do that. And I think that's something that it feels very much like it's been under attack with just how the current administration and legislature has been kind of stripping away these local control and making it more centralized so they can dictate terms of these municipalities.
And the local control has been, so that people listening, maybe they don't know this, the Republicans have been the ones that have been dominating that conversation, have been legislating that. It has not been the state Democrats. It has been the state Republicans.
And it happens when you have the majority. You can dictate the terms, especially when you have such wide margins in the House and in the state Senate. You can dictate these terms, and that's I try and avoid using partisan language, because I think it's important to have these conversations without it reverting to mudslinging, but that's what what I was speaking about is what I see happening to our local communities and what I think we could improve upon.
So let's move on because there's a few other things to talk about. Okay. So another thing that your opponent talks about in his commercial, in his 15 seconds, is that he wants to boost funding for schools. Mm-hmm. It's kind of vague. We don't know what schools he's talking about. I think we have an idea, obviously.
Right.
But that's very boost funding. So, what are your thoughts on education, voucher programs? Where are you at with that?
That was the first thing you mentioned. I'm really curious to hear.
Yeah. Well, it's actually, it was the last time I was on, that's something we talked about for about 50 minutes, and it was a very good discussion. It certainly opened my eyes to the issues that were happening in the community that I wasn't aware of. But right now, where I stand, I believe how we look at education in our state has certainly changed drastically over the last 6-7 years, in my opinion. You look at the budget cuts to not only public schools at the K through 12 level, but certainly the funding that's been taken away from state higher education institutions. That's been of big concern to me. And I think what my priorities lie with education is at the very top of my list for priorities in the state right now. It comes from two places. One, from a personal place. I'm very much involved in education still. I don't have that kind of break. I've been going to school since I was 5 years old. I know what it's like to be in a higher education situation where you understand the consequences of high student loan debt. And I've also been in a very small rural high school where I see what happens to educators there and what's happening to the community there when they're not getting the funding. You have to basically keep the school open through referendums, which is, I don't think, a very sustainable way of going about supporting our institutions statewide. So I certainly support funding, increasing funding for public schools.
How do you feel about school vouchers? I know you just talked about local control for some of the other ordinances in the municipalities, and I would think that would be a pretty logical next step. The locals had control over their education.
Right. I will say this about our voucher program in our state right now. I think at one point it was certainly used as a tool of empowerment for communities that otherwise may not have had the opportunity to go to a school they felt best represented them. And this was done, I believe, in the 80s in terms of the city of Milwaukee. What we've seen happen to voucher schools now is they've been taken over, and the cap for applying for a tax break with these schools has gone up almost exponentially. And now it's being used to serve more private interests, and it's being subsidized by taxpayers. And the taxpayers don't have a say because these schools don't have to follow anti-discriminatory practices. They can deny based on gender, based on orientation.
Disability. That's one of my biggest pet peeves with that whole thing, is that you actually have these voucher schools. And I've called and inquired about this many times in different school districts. You have a private school who takes voucher money, taxpayer money, and you have a child that's disabled. If you want that child to go to this school, they can't guarantee that, they can't facilitate that disabled child. Now, if you bring in your own program as a parent for your child that is disabled, that's fine. They'll accept your child, but they will not facilitate that for you. They don't, say that they're not going to take the children in, the disabled children, but they're going to, you're on your own. We're in a public school. The taxpayer resources are used to help educate that child. And no one can answer that question of why that's okay. And, you're taking money from the schools that are facilitating disabled children and putting it into voucher schools. And yet the child can't go there unless they spend more money on top of the private school tuition to be taken care of. That is probably my biggest issue with voucher program, not to mention they're closing as well. What do you think about that issue with disabled children? Because where are they supposed to go?
I think it boils down to a question of morality. Do we as a state want to be subsidizing schools that are working for everyone? Now, we can have arguments about curriculum. We can talk about this. We can have discussions. But is their mandate to serve everyone, or is their mandate to serve some people? And some people may not include a child with disabilities, or gender, or sexual orientation, or religious affiliation. And that, in my opinion, it's kind of dangerous when you're willing to dictate what your taxpayer money is going to in terms of education for some or education for all. And I know Representative Mako has voted on legislation that would siphon, I believe, $800 million out of public schools over the next 10 years for the expansion of the voucher program that he is interested in pushing forward. And I would have grave concerns about that. And I think it just boils down to,
what if the parents' choice is that those schools do best meet their needs for their children?
I think then you have the conversation of, more, let's look towards what we can be doing better in public schools then. Get involved in your public schools, elect legislators who are going to listen in that regard and help change the curriculum perhaps, who are going to work towards education reform if that's what you're interested in. But I believe it boils down to, at the end of the day, a state government and the federal government and government at all levels has the duty to best serve the interests of the masses who otherwise may not, they can't make these legislative decisions. They can't look at anti-discriminatory policies and make that decision. We are elected to uphold what is moral and what is good. And I just would have a grave concern about subsidizing any program that works under a discriminatory policy.
Especially when the needs that typically when they choose these schools, it's based on religion. Really, that is so ironic to me. So we're not getting any taxpayer resources from a church. They don't pay taxes, yet a lot of families are choosing these schools because of that. In fact, that just right there, the religious piece of it, yet we're not getting any funding from them. And I wonder if we're ever going to see a day where we actually can get some funding. If you want to have all of this, there's no regulation, you just want to have these schools and you want the choice. It all sounds really great, but the reality is it's typically coming from a Christian perspective, but yet there's no resources put forth from them. So it's so hypocritical to me. And again, the disabled piece of it, if you're disabled, if your state senator, Ron Johnson, he put into place, and I don't believe it passed, thank God, but with the Department of Justice, he wanted to eliminate the Disability Act, at least half of it, so that private schools didn't have to respond to that. They weren't accountable. And so there is such a mixed message out there of, this school of choice, it's a better fit. Why? You literally have schools who are excluding children. Mind you, possibly...
But you can still choose not to send your children there.
You can choose not to, but I can't choose not to send my taxpayer money there. And that's the part that's the biggest piece of it that doesn't make sense at all.
And the big issue is, and again, I kind of touched on it, I don't think I articulated it particularly well, but I think it boils down to, we as legislators have to look at how best to serve the community. And in my opinion, and I'm not saying this to the detriment of families who want to have their children have a religious education, but I'm saying our duty is to the public. And right now, it's when you siphon away money from the public to a special interest, and that's what religion is. It's tough to say, but religion is a special interest. And when you siphon away from public schools and you put it into an interest as that, you're not serving the common interest. You're serving special.
I want to challenge you for just a minute and go back to the water topic, because basically what you just said is a similar circumstance as siphoning away money to a special interest, namely the EPA, to enact some of these regulations. And some of these regulations tend to be rather restrictive and can do harm to the public who you're trying to help on these farms. So how do you take the position in that instance where you want to...
How would they do harm? Can you back that up? How would they do
I'm more
harm?
than, if I may, well, if you could say what you're implying by harm, And then I'm more than happy to answer the question after that.
Well, a lot of the regulations,
explain my position.
Farmers specifically are,
of course.
They're going to be more restrictive in wastewater and irrigation, things like that. It impacts their business. It has an effect on cost, which will trickle down to.
So it's financial.
Their produce.
It's a financial harm.
Well,
in this instance, yeah.
Okay. And I will be honest.
We're not talking about physical harm. We're talking about financial harm.
Because harm does exist in different facets. There's financial harm. There's educational harm.
In either case, you're putting them at a disadvantage.
And you can make that argument, but I would counter that with the concept of what is better, a bottom line, or the health and well-being of a part of our state and our whole state and our nation as a whole. Now.
But their bottom line is affecting our whole state.
And yes, it is.
Products are going to become more expensive.
I would also put out to you that not having an environment that is even cohesive to farming going forward, because if you keep with these practices that I believe are unsustainable, and I'm not blaming anyone for doing that. I'm just saying the regulations, I come from a family of farmers, and we talk consistently about this. And it's a small family farm. It's not a COFA. I think they have about my uncle and aunt have about 100 head of cattle, and that fluctuates obviously. But we talk a lot, and their biggest concern is we had the chance to regulate ourselves. We had the chance to stop these concentrated feeding operations from this unsustainable practice. And that also applies to economics, because if you look at how the dairy industry has developed, it was almost like a subprime mortgage crisis for the dairy industry. There was literature that told these COFAs and farmers in general, hey, now is the time to expand, keep getting bigger. The price is never going to go down. And then all of a sudden that dairy pricing bubble burst. And all of a sudden you're left with a huge surplus of dairy supplies. There was reports that Wisconsin, or I think the United States, has dumped so much, millions of gallons of dairy product. There's a surplus right now, but then it's almost self-perpetuating because you have these farms that have expanded way beyond their means because they were told it's a smart investment choice, but now you have to keep getting bigger to even meet your bottom line. So I would posit to you the time for the self-regulation within the industry has unfortunately gone, and we're not trying to harm these COFAs. We're not trying to make a family choose between environmental regulation and a livelihood. We want to help them. We want to make sure that we're incentivizing responsibility, sustainability. But we also have to take those actions because the way it's going right now, it's affecting these small family farms who can't possibly keep up. They can't afford to expand to 5,000 head of cattle. It's not sustainable for them. It's not sustainable for the COFAs, and it's not sustainable for economics either. And that also applies to the environment because you have these excess of animals, and they're creating the waste that is now affecting groundwater and quality of life everywhere. So I would say, and I would push back and say, regulation is important because it helps. It might affect certain bottom lines, and there will be that cost. I won't try and dress it up any other way. But it's important that we have these regulations, and we also go to help the people that we're now imposing the regulations on to help find a way to be more sustainable, to meet your bottom line, and to practice more effective methods going forward.
So let's translate that into, another point that your opponent said in his 15-second commercial. Mm-hmm. To focus on bringing jobs to support strong families. So even with all of this regulation that's not, that they've been removing, the Republicans in the state legislature has been removing, right? Mm-hmm. These tax breaks that, the WEDC threw out there like candy, right? All of this has been out there for how long? And people are leaving the state. Companies are leaving the state and have been the entire time. Mm-hmm. So, what do they want? What do they want to have? What do they need to have? How is it possible that the Republicans continue to remove a regulation and give all these tax breaks, and it doesn't matter anyway. They leave, and they also leave with jobs. So I would love to know what John Mocco, when he says to focus on bringing jobs, how about you retain the businesses that you have here? They're leaving, and he's been in there the entire time this has been happening. Mm-hmm. So. Yeah. He's, to some degree, he hasn't done anything in the last term to keep them here. So how are we to believe in this beautiful 15-second, produced commercial that he's going to do anything? What do you feel, and how are you going to handle that? Because Manitowoc Crane had over 500 jobs leave the state and move to Philadelphia or I don't remember exactly, but it was like
they're out of state.
Out of state, they left. And so, what do you think you can do? Because this is a problem.
Is reenacting those regulations and increasing the tax rates going to draw them back?
I think you have to look at this. I think it's very easy to reduce it to tax rates are the reason businesses don't want to be here. I think that's a very easy argument to make, but I think it's also an argument that does not necessarily hold the most water at the end of the day. If you look at, and I'm going to get very macro in terms of what it's like what is out there in the United States right now. States that invest in education, to go back to education, because it's working families' rights are educational rights, to paraphrase what Secretary Clinton said all those years ago at a UN conference. We're all interconnected in some way. And when you devalue education, when you devalue educators, when you devalue, I guess, the worker as a whole, it's different. People don't want to stay. And to back up, I should have prefaced it this way. Those states that are succeeding, they're the ones investing the most in education, whether that's Massachusetts, whether that's New York, whether that's like a Vermont. They're the ones who have their workers have high satisfaction rates. Their businesses are thriving because businesses want an educated, skilled workforce. And that might not mean higher education, that's fine. But then you look at what's also happened in the state with the tax on union workers and state workers and apprenticeship programs. And those are also areas where you can get skilled labor out of. And we've also made some of those other state jobs, like my dad works as a correctional worker. And they can no longer collectively bargain for their safety. I mean, if you look what's happening in Green Bay right now with the correctional institution, there have been, I believe, 4 or 5 attacks over the last 16 months. And Representative Stephan's like, well, we'll look into moving the location. And it's like, that's not going to do anything. What is going to help is if you treat your workers ethically and you've taken away their right to, come out and they're expected to work 2 to 3 shifts back to back, and that's a 16, 24-hour day in a prison. I mean, it boggles the mind to me to see how we have treated our workers. And I don't think people are leaving because of our high tax rates, because over the last 6 years, we've historically cut taxes.
Exactly.
Especially for businesses, these big businesses that we thought were going to come in and save our state from whatever they were saying was the big issue. And we've taken money out of education. We've taken money away from workers. Equal wage laws, prevailing wage laws have been repealed.
So to boil down the question again.
Yes.
You've proposed a lot of things that are going to cost money.
Yes, of course.
And the money's going to come from taxes on our businesses. So what do you want to do to draw those businesses back into Wisconsin so that we can have a higher tax base and
yes, of course,
money in the coffers?
And again, businesses want a workforce that is educated, that is skilled, and it takes a leap of faith in that way, because right now we talk about we need the tax base in order to bring them back. We need the tax base in order to do this, this, and this. And at the end of the day, the stuff we've taken money out of is going to be what saves us. It's about looking how we prioritize our budget. It's going to be about making sure with WEDC, making sure they're paying, go back to the tax rates that I believe they should be at, pre-2010 levels, and making sure that they're paying their fair share so they can fund our education system, so they can help fund these programs that are going to help our state. Infrastructure building is another big thing we need to focus on. I believe our roads are graded out one of the either lower half of the country or bottom 10. And it's the same with our bridges as well, and that's kind of similar, but it's so hard to boil this all down to one question because it's all so connected. What happens to our educational system affects our workforce, which affects our businesses. And when you see educators leaving at an alarming rate, in my opinion, you see educators not wanting to stay in the state because it's the only state in the union that doesn't require you to have a bachelor's degree in education in order to teach now. And that's an issue. So it's basically telling students, well, it doesn't even pay to get an educational degree in this state. you might as well go elsewhere and take your skills, what you've learned, what you've paid a good amount of money for out of state and utilize that. And you'd look away with the rights and the pay that have been taken away from educators as well. So it's all connected. And then that goes into, do we have an educated, skilled workforce that can go forward? And that goes into, well, do businesses want to stay in a place where they can get skilled labor and they want to have educated labor? And it all feeds into one another.
And really what's happening is we are creating this huge, gap between corporations and workers. And the middle class is really taking the brunt of that. I mean, it's never been so, we are so far apart right now.
Yeah.
And that the system that's out there right now, that is exactly what's happening. It doesn't value workers. It values corporations. I mean, I'm sorry. What do you need to come back? How greedy do you have to be? How much money do you need? I mean, I can't believe that, it's okay for them to just have all these demands.
Yeah.
And their workers work for a pittance.
Who's them?
The corporations. What do you need to come back? Really?
But there are job creators and there
are job creators, but what they need to realize is, you do get tax breaks. You don't create jobs. You end up cutting and leaving, but your CEOs are taking a lot of that money. I think that's ridiculous and amazing that they actually get away with it.
If I may interject, which I've done several times, so I apologize.
You're the candidate. That's what you're supposed to do.
That's okay. I always like just sitting back and kind of enjoying everything. That sounds like a very strange term to use, but I think very much right now we have this conception that corporations are job creators, that they are the ones who are going to drive economic development going forward. And while I see some validity to that, because obviously they're the ones who they're creating the jobs, they're the ones who you can go to and you get hired by, but the most important commodity of a corporation are the workers they have. And when you're not taking care of your workers, that's dangerous. And at the end of the day, a corporation is beholden to one thing, and that's a bottom line. They're not beholden necessarily to, now some do this. Some do treat their workers exceedingly well, and they do a lot for them. But at the end of the day, a corporation is about one thing, and that's a bottom line. And when you invest in only a bottom line, you're going to get results that aren't best for the families.
And that's a formula for anyone. That's a formula for corporations. That's a formula for a relationship, right? I mean, you have to feel valued in general to want to do more, to even just, stay in the game. In a relationship, why would it be any different for a corporation and a worker? And I apologize, we have to wrap up. It's been,
not a problem.
We've gone to our little over our 30 minutes, actually. Is there anything you want to tell people as far as like how to get a hold of you? That you have, 3 weeks left? Not even?
Yeah, not even. I don't know when this will air, but it might even be like 1 week or tomorrow or whatever, whenever this comes out. But you can get a hold of me. I have a website. It's noahreif.com. You can find me on Facebook at Reif for Wisconsin. You can find me on Twitter, the same place. Feel free to contact my website. There's a contact page there. I'll be sure to get back to you as soon as I can. And if I may leave with just a brief kind of, I hope like a campaign message, just so hopefully people understand what I'm about. At the end of the day, I believe it boils down to three things. It boils down to how we're treating our educators, and therefore the students who are now the ones who are being informed by those educators. It boils down to taking care of working class families, because they are the backbone of any economic driving. Like at the end of the day, you have to have a successful middle class equals a successful economy, in my opinion. And working class families fit into that perfectly. And you have to be taking care of our natural resources. And we need people in government who are not necessarily going to worry about partisan concerns. Because don't get me wrong, I'm going as a Democrat. I'm a progressive, tried and true. But I also want people to know that when I go to these events, when I go to forums, I want to serve people at the end of the day, because I've gone to conservative forums where I know I'm not going to get votes out of it. But it's about starting these dialogues, starting these conversations, and hopefully I've convinced people of my sincerity and my passion for this state, for its people, and hopefully I do believe that we can empower our state again and our workers again. So
well, good luck to you, Noah.
Well, thank you for having me, Adam.
Thank you for coming in.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. And that's it for episode 45. Before we go, we want to thank our sponsor, Release Wire. It's a powerful media engagement service connecting businesses to interested journalists and bloggers. ReleaseWire is an effective and affordable way to get the word out about your business. As a fan of Political Radar, we have a special offer for you. Distribute your first on-demand press release with ReleaseWire and save 25%. Visit releasewire.com/politicalradar or click on the link in the video description to learn more. For show notes and more about this episode, visit www.politicalradar.com/45. And also, we would love to have you be a part of our Political Radar community Facebook page. There's great discussion on there on politics and all kinds of interesting things, local, state, and national levels. Thanks for our co-host for filling in for Elliot, Adam
Absolutely.
Funk.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. And anyone wants to get a hold of you, how can they do that?
Facebook, Adam Funk. I'm also on the Political Radar community, so you can reach me there. I spend a lot of time downtown on Broadway, and you can find me at my store.
Okay, great. And you can get in touch with me on Facebook and at Sitnicow on Twitter. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for listening to Political Radar. To ensure that you never miss an episode, subscribe on iTunes or your favorite podcast app. To stay up to date, visit politicalradar.com or connect with us on Facebook or Twitter.